The recording played twice in that courtroom. The first time, the room went still. That particular kind of still where 40 people stopped breathing at once. The second time, my son couldn't look up from the table. She won't even know it hit her. We just need to make sure the paperwork is in order before anyone thinks to ask questions. That was my daughter-in-law's voice. Clear as anything. Cool as January. I'd been a homicide investigator for 31 years. I know what premeditation sounds like. I know the difference between someone saying something careless in anger and someone saying something they've already decided. She'd already decided. She'd been deciding for months. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Porter Whitman. I'm 68 years old. I spent 3 decades with the Memphis Police Department, the last 12 as lead detective in the Homicide Division. I've sat across from killers in interrogation rooms. I've watched people lie to my face with tears running down their cheeks. I've read confessions from men who felt nothing, and eulogies for men who deserved better. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. My son proved me wrong. His name is Garrett. He's 41. When he was 9 years old, he used to sit in the passenger seat of my cruiser on Saturday mornings while I ran errands, asking me about every case I'd ever worked. Not the gory parts, the puzzle parts. Why did the suspect do this? How did you know where to look? He had a mind like a steel trap, my boy. Sharp, curious, methodical. I don't know exactly when that changed. Maybe it happened slowly, the way erosion happens. You don't see it day by day, but one morning you look at the riverbank and it's just gone. Or maybe I just wasn't paying close enough attention. He met Nadine 6 years ago at a fundraiser for something I can't even remember now. She was striking. Tall, dark hair. The kind of composure that reads like confidence until you've been around it long enough to recognize it as calculation. I didn't dislike her immediately. I want to be honest about that. I thought she was driven. I thought she was focused. I thought those were good qualities. The first time she asked about my pension, we'd known each other 4 months. Not in a pointed way. Casual. We were having dinner at Garrett's apartment, and she asked how retirement worked for someone in my position, what the benefits looked like, whether the city had changed the structure for officers who'd served as long as I had. I answered her. Why wouldn't I? I thought it was genuine curiosity. A year later, I noticed she'd started asking Garrett those questions when she thought I wasn't listening. And Garrett had started repeating her answers back to me as if they were his own ideas. Dad, have you thought about what you'd do at the house if you ever needed more liquidity? Dad, do you have everything in order with your estate? Dad, you should really talk to a financial advisor about restructuring. I had thought about those things. I'd been thinking about them since my wife Eleanor passed, 4 years before Nadine came along. Eleanor and I had built something careful and quiet over 40 years of marriage. A house in East Memphis that we'd paid off in full, some savings, a piece of land in Tennessee my father had left me. Nothing spectacular. But, honest. Built from 2 people working hard for a long time. I told Garrett I had everything handled. He nodded and changed the subject. The shift I should have caught sooner was the way he stopped visiting alone. Every time Garrett came over, Nadine was with him. And every time, she'd find reasons to walk through the house, commenting on the furniture, asking how old the roof was, standing in the doorway of my study looking at the bookshelves with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not admiration. Something quieter than that. Something more proprietary. The second thing I should have caught was the way Garrett stopped pushing back. My son used to argue with me. Good arguments. About policy, about cases I'd worked, about the right way to handle a situation. He had opinions and he defended them. Somewhere in the 5th year of his marriage, he stopped. Not gradually. It happened like a switch. One visit, he'd debate me about something minor and good-natured, and the next, he'd just agree with whatever Nadine said, and look at the floor when I tried to draw him out. I mentioned it to my neighbor Arlene once over coffee. She'd known Garrett since he was small. That woman has got him turned around, she said plainly. I didn't disagree, but I also didn't know what to do about it. A man grown is a man grown. I wasn't going to chase my son around trying to compete with his wife for his attention. That's not dignity, and it's not love either. So I watched, and I waited, and I hoped I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. The plan, as I eventually pieced it together, was this. Nadine had decided I was getting old enough that a push in the right direction might be justified. That's the sanitized version. The real version is darker. She'd been researching guardianship laws in Tennessee for 8 months before she acted. I know this because Detective Priscilla Okafor, a woman I'd trained 15 years ago, and who still called me sir out of habit, found the search history on Nadine's home computer after everything unraveled. 8 months of searches. How to petition for guardianship of an elderly parent. What constitutes diminished capacity? Can a family member contest a will? How to establish power of attorney without the subject's cooperation. 8 months. She'd also been talking to a man named Holloway. He wasn't a real attorney. He had a suspended license and a gift for telling people what they wanted to hear. He'd helped a family in Shelby County do something similar 3 years earlier. Helped them have a parent declared incompetent, took a cut of the estate proceeds, disappeared before the appeals court could catch up with him. He'd relocated to Nashville and rebranded. Nadine found him through a forum I don't want to name here. But she found him. What they didn't know, I knew, was that my old partner from 20 years back, a man named Chester Biggs, had been watching Holloway for 18 months on behalf of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Chester had retired the same year I did, but couldn't sit still, and so he'd taken on some consulting work. When Holloway started sniffing around a new target, Chester's contacts flagged it. Chester called me on a Wednesday afternoon in October. "Porter," he said, "I need you to tell me if the name Holloway means anything to you." It didn't. Not yet. "It might soon," Chester said. "Somebody in your circle has been talking to him." I sat with that for 3 days before I said anything to anyone. 31 years in homicide teaches you patience the way nothing else can. The worst thing an investigator can do is act on half the information. You wait. You let the picture fill in. You don't move until you can see the whole thing. I called Chester back on Saturday. "Tell me everything you know," I said, "and then tell me what I can do to help." What happened next took 4 months. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes hear a story like this and think it unfolded quickly, dramatically, like a movie. It didn't. It was 4 months of careful, quiet, methodical work. The kind of work I'd done my whole career. The kind of work that requires you to set aside everything you're feeling and think clearly. There were moments I couldn't do that. Moments when I was sitting alone in the house Eleanor and I had shared for 35 years, reading documents that outlined how my own son's wife planned to have me declared incompetent. And I had to just stop and breathe. Just breathe and remind myself that feeling it later was fine. Right now, I needed to think. The first thing I did was call my attorney, a woman named Frances Albright, who'd handled Eleanor's estate and who had the particular combination of sharp intelligence and unshakable calm that I have always considered the mark of a truly excellent lawyer. I told her everything Chester had told me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "We're going to document everything. Every conversation, every visit, every question about your finances. Do you have a journal?" I started one that evening. The second thing I did was install cameras. 4 of them: living room, kitchen, front entryway, and my study. I put them in myself. 31 years of crime scenes had given me a working knowledge of where people look and where they don't. I put one inside the spine of an oversized atlas on the study bookshelf. I put one in the kitchen clock above the refrigerator. By the time Garrett and Nadine came for Thanksgiving, every room they'd walked through was covered. The third thing I did was nothing. I sat in that house, and I let them come to me, and I acted like a man who didn't know a thing. Nadine made her first real move in December. She'd arranged for a doctor, not my doctor, a man I'd never met, to come to the house under the pretense of a wellness check. She told Garrett I'd agreed to it. I hadn't agreed to anything. But I let the man in, and I sat down across from him, and I answered his questions. And I watched the way he wrote down my answers, and I understood exactly what he was doing. He was building a file. Documenting, looking for inconsistencies, Gaps, signs of confusion. I give him none. I was pleasant. I was precise. I asked him where he'd done his residency, and he told me, and I asked 2 specific follow-up questions about the program that he had to think to answer. At the end of the visit, he shook my hand and said I seemed sharp as a tack. Nadine called Garrett that evening. I have the recording. He was too alert. It didn't go the way I expected. We may need to move faster. Garrett's response, how much faster? Before he changes anything with his accounts. Before he talks to anyone. That was December 14th. I remember the date because it was the day I stopped having any doubt about what I was dealing with. Francis filed 3 documents that week. A notarized statement of my full cognitive competence, signed by my actual physician of 11 years. An updated will, the real one, witnessed by Francis herself and 2 members of her firm, and the limited power of attorney designating Chester Biggs as my financial representative should I become incapacitated. Specifically and explicitly excluding Garrett and Nadine from any such role. We had it all done before Christmas. They made their move in February. Garrett called me on a Sunday morning. Voice careful the way voices get when someone has rehearsed. He said he and Nadine were worried about me. That they'd spoken with a doctor who'd raised some concerns after a visit. That they thought it might be time to talk about my living situation, my finances, my long-term care. I said, why don't you both come over Tuesday? We can sit down and talk. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Nadine walked in with a folder, an actual physical folder, which told me she'd expected this to go a certain way, expected me to be confused or defensive or to fold under the weight of whatever she'd prepared. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, with her hands folded on top of the folder and her face arranged into something that was meant to look like concern. We've spoken with an attorney, she began, about the options available to us as family members when we have genuine concerns about a parent's well-being. I let her finish. I let her lay out the whole thing. The doctor's report. The guardianship petition. The language about diminished capacity. Garrett sat beside her and said almost nothing. He had the look of a man who'd agreed to something he knew was wrong and had committed too far to stop. When she finished, I nodded slowly. Nadine, I said, how long have you been working with Holloway? The color left her face so completely and so instantly that Garrett actually turned to look at her. I kept going. I laid it out calmly, piece by piece. The search history, the forum, Chester's investigation, the meetings she'd had with Holloway at a coffee shop in Brentwood on 4 separate occasions. I slid photographs across the table. Time-stamped. Clear. The updated will has been filed, I said. My competence has been legally established. Chester Biggs is my designated financial representative. And that doctor who came to this house in December, the one whose license is currently under review by the Tennessee Medical Board, has already been interviewed by investigators. I folded my hands on the table. Same as she had. What you described as a wellness check was an attempt to build fraudulent documentation. What you're holding in that folder is a guardianship petition based on a manufactured medical opinion, and the man who helped you construct it is cooperating with the state investigation because the alternative was considerably worse for him. The room was very quiet. Garrett looked at the photographs. He looked at Nadine. He looked at me. Dad, I'd like you both to leave, I said. Francis will be in touch. The case took 8 months to work through the system. I won't pretend it was clean or fast or simple. It wasn't. There were delays and motions and days when I sat in Francis's office, reading through filings, and felt something I hadn't felt in my entire career. The specific, grinding exhaustion of being the victim rather than the investigator. That's harder than people imagine. When you spent your life on the other side of these situations, being the one things are happening to feels almost physically wrong. Like wearing your shoes on the wrong feet. You keep reaching for tools you don't have anymore. What I did have was documentation. 31 years of building cases had taught me that the difference between a conviction and an acquittal is almost always the quality of the evidence. We had good evidence. We had exceptional evidence. The prosecution was handled by an assistant district attorney named Kwame Osei, 34 years old and absolutely relentless. I liked him immediately. He reminded me of the younger detectives I'd mentored, the ones who came in already certain that the truth mattered and hadn't yet had that certainty worn down by bureaucracy. Holloway pled out. That's what men like Holloway do when they realize the ceiling is coming down. He provided a signed statement detailing every conversation he'd had with Nadine, every document she'd asked him to prepare, every fee she'd paid him with money from the joint account she shared with my son. Garrett's money. Money Garrett had earned, used to fund a scheme Garrett had apparently been told was just getting ahead of some paperwork. I believe my son when he says he didn't understand the full extent of what Nadine was doing. I want to be careful here, because belief and absolution are not the same thing. He should have asked harder questions. He should have stopped when something felt wrong, rather than telling himself it was fine. He had more information than he used, and people were going to be hurt because of it. That matters. It has to matter. The trial. And it was a trial, because Nadine declined to accept a plea. Lasted 6 days. I testified on day 4. Frances had prepared me thoroughly, but she'd also said something that stayed with me. They're going to suggest you engineered this, that you set a trap to destroy your daughter-in-law. Don't get defensive about it. Just tell the truth clearly. Nadine's attorney was a man named Briscoe. He was polished in the way that people who charge too much tend to be polished. He spent 20 minutes suggesting that my actions had been vindictive, that I'd used my law enforcement connections to build a case against a daughter-in-law I'd never liked, that Chester's involvement was a conflict of interest, that the recordings were obtained under questionable circumstances. He asked me directly, "Mr. Whitman, isn't it true that you disliked Nadine from the beginning of her relationship with your son?" I had concerns about her, I said. Based on what? Based on the fact that the third time I ever met her, she asked about my pension. A few people in the gallery made sounds. Briscoe moved on quickly. He tried a different angle. You're a retired homicide detective. You had resources, contacts, an understanding of how to build a legal case. Isn't it possible that an ordinary person without your background might make some of these same inquiries out of simple concern? I looked at him steadily. Ordinary people concerned about a family member don't spend 8 months researching guardianship fraud. They make a phone call. They have a conversation. They say, "Dad, I'm worried about you." In 31 years, I arrested a lot of people who said they had ordinary explanations for extraordinary behavior. The explanations that sound most reasonable are usually the ones that took the most time to prepare. Briscoe had no follow-up to that. He sat down. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I sat in Frances's waiting room on the second afternoon reading a fishing magazine I had no interest in, because sitting still requires something to look at. Kwame called at 4:17. Verdicts in. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, given everything. Nadine came in with Briscoe, and she looked like someone preparing to receive bad news with dignity. Garrett wasn't there. I'd been told he was cooperating with the prosecution. I didn't know what that cost him. The jury came in. On the charge of attempted elder financial fraud in the first degree, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of obtaining a fraudulent medical opinion for legal purposes, guilty. 3 charges. 3 verdicts. Nadine closed her eyes when the third one came and didn't open them for a long moment. The sentencing was 3 weeks later. Briscoe argued for leniency, no prior record, a difficult marriage, undue influence from Holloway. Kwame countered that premeditation spanning 8 months, the targeting of an elderly victim, and the use of the legal system itself as a weapon warranted the maximum available. Judge Harmon, the woman who'd been on the bench in Shelby County for 22 years and who had the particular look of someone who has heard every excuse there is, sentenced Nadine to 9 years in the Tennessee Department of Correction. Additionally, she and Holloway were jointly ordered to pay $214,000 in restitution, covering my legal fees, the investigative costs, and damages. As they led Nadine out, she looked toward the gallery once. I don't know who she was looking for. I don't think she found them. Garrett came to my house 2 weeks after the sentencing. I'd known he would eventually. He sat in the same chair his mother used to sit in. at the kitchen table where we'd had 10,000 meals together, and he looked at his hands for a long time before he looked at me. I should have asked more questions, he said. Yes, I said. You should have. I told myself it was just planning, that she was just being practical. I know. I didn't know it would go this far. I looked at him. My son. The 9-year-old who'd sat in my cruiser asking about puzzles. The 41-year-old who'd sat at the same table and listened to his wife explain how to remove his father from his own life. Here's what I've learned in 31 years, I said. The people who end up in the worst situations are almost never the ones who made one enormous bad decision. They're the ones who made 100 small ones. Each one felt reasonable at the time. Each one made the next one easier. And somewhere in the middle of all those small decisions, they crossed a line they didn't even notice. He was quiet for a while. What happens now? He asked. That depends on what you do, I said. I can't tell you who to be. I never could. But I can tell you that I'm still here, and I'm still your father. Those two things are true, and they'll stay true. What you do with them is up to you. He nodded. He didn't stay long. There were no clean reconciliations, no easy forgiveness. That's not how real things work. But he came, and he sat down, and he looked me in the eye. That's something. I don't know yet if it's enough. I sold the piece of land in Tennessee my father had left me. I'd been holding on to it for sentimental reasons that had slowly calcified into habit. I didn't need it, and I didn't use it. And there were people who did need it. I donated the proceeds, just over $380,000, to a nonprofit that provides free legal representation to elderly individuals facing fraudulent guardianship petitions. They'd represented 43 clients the previous year. They'd weaponed 39 of those cases. Francis told me they cried when the check cleared. I bought a truck I'd been meaning to buy for 4 years, a good one with a proper cab. And I started going out to Pickwick Lake on weekends the way I had promised Eleanor I would when I retired. She loved that lake. She would have loved to see me finally sitting still on it. I take my rod out in the mornings when the water is flat and the light is low. And I think about cases the way I've always thought about cases. Not with urgency, not anymore. Just with the quiet habit of a mind that spent 3 decades working puzzles. Sometimes I think about Garrett. Sometimes I think about Nadine. About what made her the kind of person who could look at an old man's life and see only its monetary value. I don't have an answer to that second question. In 31 years, I learned to find evidence and establish facts. But I never learned to understand the specific calculus that turns a person cold. Maybe nobody can. What I know is this. I built something with my hands and my years and the woman I loved, and I protected it. And it's still mine. The house is quiet. The lake is beautiful in the morning. I'm 68 years old, and I'm starting over in the only way that makes sense at 68. Not from scratch, but from what's left, which turns out to be more than I thought. Chester came out to fish with me last Saturday. He caught 3 bass and talked the whole time, which is exactly what Chester does. And I let him, because some things don't change, and you learn to love the ones that don't. On the drive home, he said, "You know what still gets me? She thought she had you figured out. She had a version of me figured out," I said, "the version she needed me to be." Chester shook his head. 31 years of homicide, and she thought she could outmaneuver you. I thought about Nadine in that kitchen chair, folder on the table, hands folded like she was presenting a business proposal. I thought about the look on her face when I said Holloway's name. People who plan to take something from someone, I said, spend all their time thinking about what they're going to take. They don't spend enough time thinking about who they're taking it from. Chester laughed at that. Long and genuine. I let the road go by for a while, thinking about Eleanor, thinking about Garrett, thinking about the 9-year-old in the passenger seat, who wanted to know how puzzles worked. Some of them you solve. Some of them you just carry. But you keep going. That's the thing nobody tells you. The ending isn't really an ending. You keep getting up, keep making coffee, keep driving out to the lake. The water doesn't ask you what happened. The morning doesn't wait for you to be ready. So you show up anyway. That's all. That's enough. I spent a lot of time sitting with what happened, not replaying it the way you do when something still has a hold on you, but the slower kind of sitting, the kind where you're not looking for answers anymore, just trying to understand the shape of the thing. What strikes me most, when I'm honest about it, is how ordinary the beginning was. Nadine didn't walk into my son's life looking like someone who would eventually sit across from me with a folder full of legal documents designed to remove me from my own home. She looked like a woman with ambition and direction. Those aren't bad qualities. The same qualities in a different person, pointed in a different direction. Build something worth being proud of. But character isn't just what you have. It's what you do with it, and the choices you make when nobody's watching, or when you think nobody's watching. She made her choices in search engines at 11 o'clock at night. She made them over coffee, with a man whose license had been suspended for doing exactly what she was asking him to help her do again. She made them slowly, deliberately, across 8 months, telling herself each step of the way that it was justified. That's what I keep coming back to, not the scheme itself, but the accumulation of decisions that built it. Nobody does something like that in one moment. They do it in 100 small moments, each one making the next one feel more reasonable. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't protect you in the dramatic moments. It protects you in the ones that don't feel dramatic at all. The moment you decide to ask one more question instead of looking away. The moment you stop and say, wait, something about this isn't right, even when admitting that is inconvenient. Gary had those moments. He had more of them than he used. And that will stay with him a long time, as it should. Because living with the consequences of your own moral shortcuts is one of the harder educations a person receives. For my part, I don't think what I did was extraordinary. I did what I'd spent 31 years learning to do. I paid attention. I documented. I was patient. I let the facts do the work that emotion would have bungled. That's not a special gift. It's a discipline. It's something you build the same way you build anything, by choosing it repeatedly, even when it cost you something, even when it would be easier to stop. What I hope, when I think about anyone who might hear this story, is that they take from it not the drama of what happened, but the quieter thing underneath. The reminder that clarity matters, that knowing who you are, and what you've built, and what you're willing to protect. That knowledge is not passive. It has to be active. It has to be tended. I'm 68 years old, and I've started over in ways I didn't expect to. Eleanor is gone. My son and I are somewhere between estranged and figuring it out. The land my father left me now funds legal representation for people who didn't have a Chester Biggs to call. Some mornings on the lake, the water is so flat it looks like glass. I sit there and I think, this is what you work for, not the verdict, not the sentencing. This, the quiet, the light, the sense that what you built is still yours, and you protected it with your eyes open. That's what's left when the rest of it is over. And it turns out, that's enough.